the 17-foot Boston whaler named Sarah Jo cut through the morning swells off Hana Bay, her 85-horsepower outboard humming with mechanical confidence as 5 friends chased the promise of fresh fish and ocean freedom. It was 10 o'clock on February 11th, 1979, and the Pacific stretched endlessly blue beneath a deceptively calm Hawaiian sky. What began as a routine day trip would become one of the most haunting maritime mysteries in modern history. A puzzle that would span nearly a decade, stretch across 2,000 miles of open ocean, and leave 4 families forever wondering what happened to the men they loved. Benjamin "Benny" Kalama, 38 years old, had organized the expedition. His weathered hands gripped the wheel as he navigated the familiar waters off Maui's eastern shore, the trade winds carrying the scent of plumeria and salt spray across the deck. Beside him stood Scott Moorman, 27, whose easy laugh had echoed across Hana Bay just minutes earlier as they loaded their gear. Patrick Woessner, 26, checked their fishing tackle with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent countless weekends chasing marlin in these waters. Peter Hanchett, 31, scanned the horizon through salt-stained sunglasses, while Ralph Malaiakini, 27, secured the coolers they'd optimistically brought for their catch. The fiberglass hull sliced through the swells with the confidence of 5 men who knew these waters intimately. They'd launched from the Hana Bay ramp in mid-morning, following a ritual as familiar as breathing fuel topped off, radio checked, emergency gear stowed. The Boston whaler was small but seaworthy, built for exactly this kind of day trip that had become their regular escape from the routines of island life. None of them noticed how quickly the morning's gentle breeze was beginning to shift. The Alanuihaha Channel, the treacherous stretch of water between Maui and the Big Island, had earned its reputation through centuries of claiming vessels and lives. Local fishermen respected its moods, reading the subtle signs that separated safe passage from disaster. But that morning, the ocean kept its intentions hidden beneath a surface that promised nothing more dangerous than a day of good fishing and salt air camaraderie. As Sarah Jo disappeared beyond the curve of Maui's coastline, heading into waters that had tested mariners since the first Polynesian voyagers, the 5 friends had no way of knowing they were sailing toward a fate that would baffle investigators, oceanographers, and search teams for nearly 10 years. Before we continue into what became one of the Pacific's most enduring mysteries, drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. If this story hooks you the way it hooked us during research, hit that like button and subscribe. Because what happened next defies everything we think we know about survival, ocean currents, and the thin line between life and death. By early afternoon, the Pacific had begun to reveal its true nature. The gentle swells that had rocked Sarah Jo through the morning hours started building into something far more ominous, driven by winds that would soon top 40 miles per hour. The ocean was transforming from friend to enemy, and somewhere in that vast expanse of blue, 5 men were about to discover just how quickly paradise could become purgatory. But the real mystery wasn't what happened in those churning waters off Maui. It was what would be discovered nearly 10 years later, buried in coral sand on a remote atoll 2,000 miles away. The radio crackled to life around 2 o'clock that afternoon, cutting through the mounting howl of wind with a transmission that would haunt the families of 5 men for years to come. Benjamin Kalama's voice, tight with concern but still controlled, reported what every mariner dreads most. Their engine had died, leaving Sarah Jo powerless in seas that were rapidly becoming a liquid nightmare. This single transmission represented the last confirmed contact with 5 human beings who had started their day, expecting nothing more dangerous than sunburn and the challenge of landing a decent-sized fish. By the time those words traveled across the airwaves to whoever might be listening on the CB frequencies, the Alanuihaha Channel had already begun its transformation into a 40-foot wall of moving water. Other vessels that had ventured out that morning were racing back to harbor, their captains reading the ocean's mood with the instinct that separates experienced mariners from weekend casualties. Winds screamed across the channel at speeds that turned spray into horizontal needles, while swells built into moving mountains that could swallow a 17-foot boat without leaving so much as a ripple to mark its passing. The meteorological violence unfolding in the channel wasn't unusual for February. In Hawaiian waters, experienced locals knew that winter storms could materialize with terrifying speed, turning familiar fishing grounds into oceanic battlefields. What made this particular afternoon different was timing. 5 men had ventured just far enough from shore to find themselves caught in nature's closing trap. As the afternoon stretched toward evening, a family member's growing anxiety triggered the first official response. The call to the Coast Guard came in during the late afternoon hours, carrying the weight of intuition that something had gone terribly wrong. But the search coordinators faced an immediate problem that would plague every aspect of the rescue effort. Nobody knew exactly where Sarah Jo had intended to fish. The initial search area was described by officials as ill-defined, a clinical term that barely conveyed the magnitude of the challenge facing rescue teams. The Pacific Ocean doesn't offer convenient boundaries or logical search grids. When a small vessel vanishes somewhere in the vast expanse between Hawaiian islands, searchers face the maritime equivalent of finding a specific grain of sand on an infinite beach. On February 12, 1979, the most comprehensive search and rescue operation in Hawaiian waters began deploying across 56,000 square miles of open ocean. Coast Guard cutters and helicopters launched into conditions that tested both equipment and crew endurance, while Marine Corps aircraft joined the systematic grid search that would continue for 5 grueling days. Civil Air Patrol volunteers flew pattern after pattern over white-capped seas, their eyes straining to spot any trace of orange life jackets or white fiberglass against the endless blue. The search effort even included an unusual detail that demonstrated just how desperately authorities wanted to find the missing men. 3 Navy-trained spotter pigeons were deployed, their keen eyesight serving as biological radar systems scanning the ocean's surface for signs of survivors or debris. But perhaps the most telling aspect of those 5 days came from the Hana community itself. Local residents, many of whom had fished these waters their entire lives, continued their own search efforts for nearly 4 weeks after the official operation ended. They walked beaches, scanned tide lines, and took their own boats into waters they knew intimately, driven by the kind of hope that refuses to accept the ocean's silence as final. Yet, after 29 days of searching, both official and unofficial, the Pacific had yielded nothing. No debris, no life jackets, no trace that 5 men and their boat had ever existed. How does a 17-foot vessel simply vanish without leaving a single fragment of evidence across nearly 60,000 square miles of searched ocean? The answer would remain hidden for almost 10 years, buried in coral sand on an atoll so remote that most maps didn't bother marking its existence. 9 years, 7 months, and 17 days after Sarah Jo disappeared into the churning waters off Maui, a U.S. Marine Fisheries Service research team made a discovery that would rewrite everything investigators thought they knew about the case. September 28, 1988, dawned clear and calm over Taongi Atoll in the Marshall Islands, a remote cluster of coral barely visible on most navigational charts. Sitting in isolation, 2,054 miles northwest of the last place anyone had seen 5 Hawaiian fishermen alive. The atoll's uninhabited landscape stretched like a forgotten corner of creation, where coral sand met endless Pacific horizon in a silence broken only by the eternal whisper of waves against ancient reef formations. Dr. Sarah Martinez stepped carefully across the coral rubble of Sibilla Island, the atoll's largest landmass, her boots crunching against fragments of dead reef that had been building this remote sanctuary for millennia. Her research team had come to study fish populations in these pristine waters, part of ongoing efforts to understand Pacific marine ecosystems far from human interference. The last thing she expected to find was evidence of human tragedy weathered by nearly a decade of isolation. 50 yards inland from the high tide mark, something white caught the tropical sunlight in a way that didn't match the organic curves of coral formations. As Martinez moved closer, the geometric lines resolved into something that made her pulse quicken. The unmistakable hull of a small motorboat, its fiberglass surface scoured by years of salt air and Pacific storms, but still recognizably human-made in this wilderness of coral and sand. The vessel lay on its side like a beached whale, its once pristine white hull now stained with rust, streaks, and coral growth. But even through the weathering and tropical decay, faded letters remained visible along the stern. HA, the registration prefix that identified this as a Hawaii-registered vessel. Martinez felt a chill despite the tropical heat as she realized she was looking at evidence of a journey that should have been impossible. 500 yards from the boat, following a path worn smooth by countless tides, the research team discovered something that transformed their scientific expedition into a forensic investigation. A shallow grave, marked by a crude cross fashioned from driftwood, rose from the coral sand. Its simple geometry, somehow more haunting than any elaborate monument could have been. The burial site spoke of human hands, working with whatever materials the ocean had, provided pieces of driftwood, lashed together with rope or vine, coral stones carefully arranged to mark a final resting place. Someone had taken time and effort to create this grave, following rituals of respect and remembrance, even in this most remote corner of the Pacific. When Martinez and her team carefully excavated the site, they found human remains that had been interred with obvious care. A jawbone protruded from the coral stones, and nearby lay something that would puzzle investigators for years to come. A sheaf of small papers with tiny squares of foil placed carefully between each page. The purpose of this mysterious collection remained unknown. Was it some kind of survival log, a message meant for eventual discovery, or something else entirely? The discovery of Sarah Jo on Sibylla Island raised more questions than it answered, each revelation deepening rather than resolving the mystery. How had a 17-foot boat traveled over 2,000 miles across open ocean? Who had buried these remains with such obvious care? And most haunting of all, if one man had survived long enough to reach this remote atoll, where were the other 4 members of the crew? The silence of Taongi Atoll held its secrets close, revealing just enough truth to confirm that an incredible journey had taken place, while concealing the full story of how 5 friends from Maui had become part of one of the Pacific's most enduring mysteries. But the ocean wasn't finished with its revelations, and what investigators would learn next would challenge everything they thought they understood about survival, ocean currents, and the thin line between hope and despair. The jawbone that emerged from coral sand on Sibylla Island carried within its calcium structure the answer to a question that had haunted 5 families for nearly 10 years. But that answer came wrapped in mysteries that seemed to multiply. With each forensic revelation, when dental records confirmed the remains belonged to Scott Moorman, 27, the quiet fisherman who had laughed easily on that February morning in 1979, investigators faced a puzzle that defied every assumption about survival at sea. The identification process took place at the Central Identification Laboratory, Hawaii, where forensic specialists worked with the methodical precision of archaeologists, extracting identity from fragments weathered by years of Pacific isolation. Dr. Robert Chen, the forensic pathologist who examined Moorman's remains, found himself confronting evidence that challenged his understanding of maritime disaster scenarios. The bones showed no signs of trauma that might indicate how Moorman had died, leaving investigators to speculate about his final hours on an atoll where fresh water didn't exist and rescue was an impossibility. Had he died quickly from injuries sustained during Sarah Jo's apparent journey across 2,000 miles of open ocean? Had he survived long enough to experience the cruel irony of reaching land only to face death by dehydration under an unforgiving tropical sun? The questions multiplied when drift current experts consulted by news media suggested that a vessel departing Hawaiian waters could theoretically reach the Marshall Islands in approximately 3 months, carried by the complex system of trade winds and ocean gyres that move water across the Pacific Basin like a vast, slow-motion river system. But theoretical possibilities and actual survival represented entirely different challenges. For Scott Moorman to have lived long enough to reach Taongi Atoll, Sarah Jo would have needed to remain seaworthy during a journey across some of the most remote waters on Earth. The 17-foot Boston whaler would have been at the mercy of storms, waves, and weather systems that could have destroyed it dozens of times during those theoretical 3 months. Even if the vessel had somehow survived the crossing, its occupants would have faced the gradual depletion of whatever fresh water and food they might have carried, turning their boat into a floating prison where hope diminished with each passing day. The burial site itself provided haunting evidence that someone had cared enough to inter Moorman's remains with dignity. The driftwood cross suggested that whoever performed this final act had maintained enough humanity, despite their own desperate circumstances, to honor the dead with whatever materials the ocean had provided. This simple grave marker became a monument not just to Scott Moorman's life, but to the enduring power of human compassion, even in the most isolated corners of existence. Coast Guard search teams, energized by finally having a concrete location to investigate, expanded their efforts across 6 adjacent atolls surrounding Taongi, systematically combing coral beaches and inland areas for any trace of the 4 missing crew members. They found nothing, no additional burial sites, no scattered remains, no evidence that Benjamin Kalama, Patrick Woessner, Peter Hanchett, or Ralph Malaiakini had ever reached the Marshall Islands. This absence of evidence created its own set of mysteries. If Sarah Jo had carried 5 men across the Pacific, why was only 1 body found? Had the others died during the journey and been buried at sea? Had they somehow survived longer than Moorman, only to meet their fate on different islands? Or had they never made the crossing at all, their bodies claimed by the vast Pacific during those first terrible hours when their engine died in 40-foot seas? The mysterious papers found with Moorman's remains added another layer to the puzzle. The small sheets with foil squares between pages resisted interpretation. Investigators could determine neither their purpose nor their origin. Were they part of some improvised survival system? A record of their impossible journey? A message meant for eventual discovery? The foil-backed papers became artifacts of desperation, physical evidence of human ingenuity in circumstances that defied survival. As news of the discovery spread through Hawaiian communities, families of the missing men found themselves confronting a cruel paradox. Finally having confirmation that their loved one's journey had continued beyond that final radio transmission, while simultaneously learning that 4 of the 5 remained as lost as ever. But even as Scott Moorman's identification provided closure to one family, it opened questions that would challenge everything investigators thought they knew about the limits of human endurance and the ocean's capacity for both destruction and preservation. The discovery of Scott Moorman's remains on Sibylla Island unleashed a storm of speculation that swept through maritime communities like wildfire, each theory attempting to explain how a recreational fishing trip off Maui had transformed into an epic voyage across the world's largest ocean. But every explanation that seemed to solve one piece of the puzzle inevitably created new questions that defied logical answers. The official investigation closed with clinical finality. 5 men had been declared missing at sea on February 16, 1979, and Scott Moorman's death had been confirmed, without determination of cause or exact timing, leaving families to construct their own narratives from fragments of evidence and endless speculation. Local fishing communities proposed the most compelling theory, that passing vessels likely Asian fishing fleets working the remote Pacific, had discovered Moorman's body floating in the open ocean and, following maritime tradition, had given him proper burial on the nearest available land. This explanation carried the weight of practical experience. Commercial fishermen understood both the ocean's power to preserve and the human compulsion to honor the dead, even strangers found drifting far from home. The theory gained credibility from the careful nature of the burial itself. The driftwood cross and coral stone arrangement suggested someone familiar with maritime funeral practices, someone who understood that the sea gives up its dead only temporarily and that proper respect must be paid quickly. Asian fishing crews, operating in these waters for generations, would have possessed both the cultural background and practical knowledge to perform such a burial. But this explanation collided with other evidence that complicated the narrative. A 1985 U.S. Geological Survey of Taongi Atoll had reportedly found no evidence of any wrecked vessel, raising questions about when Sarah Jo had actually arrived at Sibylla Island. Had the boat reached the atoll after 1985, suggesting an even longer journey than the already incredible 9-year timeline? Or had the survey simply missed the hull in an atoll system spanning several scattered islands? Moorman's family constructed their own heartbreaking theory from the evidence of careful burial and the mysterious foil-backed papers found with his remains. They believed Scott had survived the crossing alive, possibly as the sole survivor of a journey that had claimed his 4 companions somewhere in the vast Pacific. In this version of events, he had lived long enough to reach Sibylla Island, only to face the ultimate cruelty of finding land without fresh water, dying slowly under tropical skies, while knowing rescue would never come to such a remote location. This theory transformed the gravesite from a simple burial into something far more tragic, the final resting place of a man who had accomplished the impossible by crossing 2,000 miles of open ocean, only to discover that survival and rescue represented entirely different achievements. Oceanographic experts consulted during the investigation provided maps of current systems that could theoretically carry debris from Hawaiian waters to the Marshall Islands, but their models dealt in probabilities rather than certainties. The North Pacific Gyre, that vast circular current system that moves water clockwise across the ocean basin, could indeed transport floating objects on journeys spanning thousands of miles and many months. But the difference between a piece of debris and a boat carrying 5 human beings represented a gap that mathematics couldn't bridge. Maritime historians pointed to documented cases of vessels found far from their points of origin, carried by currents and storms across distances that defied belief. The Pacific held stories of Japanese fishing boats discovered on American shores, of debris from the 2011 tsunami washing up on distant coastlines years after the disaster. But these precedents involved empty vessels or inanimate objects, not boats that had somehow kept human occupants alive during impossible journeys. Each theory that emerged to explain Sarah Jo's fate contained enough plausibility to seem reasonable, yet none could account for all the evidence without raising new questions. The careful burial suggested human agency, but who had performed it and when? The boat's condition indicated long exposure to ocean conditions, but how had it remained intact during a crossing that should have destroyed it? The absence of 4 other crew members pointed to tragedy, but where and how had they died? As theories multiplied and speculation intensified, one uncomfortable possibility remained largely unspoken in official investigations: that the U.S. government knew more about the fate of Sarah Jo than public records indicated. Could 5 American citizens have vanished into classified waters, their fate sealed by national security considerations that valued secrecy over family closure? The whispered speculation that had haunted Hawaiian fishing communities for years finally found voice in the questions that official investigators seemed reluctant to ask. Why would the world's most powerful navy, with satellite surveillance and tracking systems spanning the entire Pacific, have no record of a vessel that had somehow traveled from Maui to the Marshall Islands carrying American citizens. The temporal gap between Sarah Joe's disappearance in 1979 and the boat's discovery in 1988 coincided with one of the most sensitive periods in American military history in the Pacific, when Cold War tensions transformed remote atolls into strategic assets worth more than human lives. The Marshall Islands during this era existed as a testing ground for weapons systems that required absolute secrecy and operational zones cleared of civilian vessels. Nuclear testing had ended, but military exercises involving submarine warfare, missile systems, and surveillance operations continued to make vast areas of the Pacific effectively off-limits to uncleared personnel. These classified operations created maritime zones where the appearance of unauthorized vessels could trigger responses that left no official records. Former Coast Guard personnel, speaking years later on condition of anonymity, described search protocols that sometimes included classified restrictions, areas where rescue operations could be suspended without explanation, where debris fields could be declared off-limits to civilian searchers, where the recovery of American citizens took secondary priority to maintaining operational security. The Pacific Ocean, despite its appearance as open water, contained invisible boundaries that civilian boaters crossed at their own risk. The 1985 survey of Taongi Atoll that had allegedly found no trace of Sarah Joe carried its own implications. Military surveys of remote Pacific atolls during this period often served dual purposes. Geological research provided cover for installing monitoring equipment, establishing communication facilities, or creating emergency landing sites for classified operations. If Sarah Joe had been discovered during such a survey, the vessel and its contents might have been removed or relocated to avoid compromising whatever classified activities were taking place in the area. The mysterious papers found with Scott Moorman's remains took on new significance when viewed through this lens. The foil-back sheets could have represented improvised attempts to signal aircraft or satellites, desperate efforts by survivors to attract attention using whatever reflective materials they could find. If such signals had been detected by military monitoring systems, the response might have been governed by classification levels rather than humanitarian concerns. Local families began to question whether the official search effort in 1979 had been as comprehensive as reported. The 56,000 square mile search area, while impressive in scope, might have excluded zones where military operations were active. If Sarah Joe had drifted into classified waters during those first crucial days after the engine failure, the vessel might have been located and its fate decided by personnel operating under orders that prioritized mission security over rescue operations. The possibility that government agencies possessed information about Sarah Joe's fate but had classified it for national security reasons offered families an explanation more disturbing than simple maritime tragedy. It suggested that 5 American citizens had been sacrificed to protect military secrets, their disappearance explained away as another unfortunate accident in dangerous waters. This theory gained credibility from the pattern of Pacific mysteries during the late 1970s and early 80s. Civilian aircraft that vanished without adequate explanation, fishing vessels that disappeared near military test zones, research expeditions that encountered classified operations and were subsequently sworn to secrecy. The Cold War Pacific had become an ocean of secrets where civilian lives could be deemed expendable when they threatened operational security. The memorial plaques eventually installed at both Taongi Atoll and Hana Bay served as monuments not just to 5 lost friends, but to questions that official investigations had failed to answer. These simple markers acknowledged tragedy while avoiding the deeper implications of how that tragedy might have unfolded in waters controlled by agencies that valued secrecy above transparency. Yet even the darkest theories about government cover-ups couldn't explain every aspect of Sarah Joe's mystery. The careful burial of Scott Moorman's remains suggested human compassion rather than clinical disposal of evidence. The preservation of identifying elements on the boat's hull indicated that someone wanted the vessel to be eventually discovered and recognized. Perhaps the truth lay somewhere between official explanations and conspiracy theories in a Pacific Ocean vast enough to swallow 5 lives without requiring government intervention, yet complex enough in its military and civilian operations to create mysteries that would never yield complete answers. The silence of Taongi Atoll had revealed just enough to confirm that an incredible journey had taken place while concealing the full story of how 5 friends from Hawaii had become footnotes in the classified history of America's Pacific Empire. The waves that break endlessly against Sibylla Island today carry the same rhythm they've maintained for millennia, indifferent to the human drama that briefly interrupted their eternal conversation with coral and sand. The memorial plaque installed at Taongi Atoll weathers under Pacific storms, its bronze surface gradually acquiring the patina that transforms all human monuments in this remote corner of the world into artifacts of temporary significance. Scott Moorman's gravesite has become a pilgrimage destination for the few researchers and military personnel who occasionally visit these isolated atolls. A simple cross of driftwood that represents one of the ocean's most haunting mysteries, finally given partial resolution. The families of Benjamin Kalama, Patrick Woessner, Peter Hanchett, and Ralph Malaiakini continue to live with questions that may never find answers. 4 men who laughed together on a February morning in 1979 remain as lost today as they were when Sarah Joe's engine died in 40-foot seas off Maui. Their absence from the burial site on Sibylla Island creates a void that encompasses not just personal grief, but the fundamental human need to understand what happens when ordinary people encounter extraordinary circumstances. The television program Unsolved Mysteries brought Sarah Joe's story to millions of viewers, transforming a local Hawaiian tragedy into a cautionary tale about the ocean's power and unpredictability. But television drama couldn't capture the deeper implications of 5 men who had ventured into waters that exist at the intersection of natural forces and classified military operations, where civilian vessels could disappear without adequate explanation or investigation. Recent advances in ocean current modeling and satellite tracking have provided new tools for understanding how debris moves across Pacific waters, but these technological improvements can't retroactively solve mysteries from 1979. The mathematical models that predict where floating objects might travel remain probabilistic rather than definitive, offering theories rather than certainties about journeys that occurred before modern surveillance systems could monitor every square mile of ocean surface. The foil-backed papers found with Moorman's remains have never been adequately explained despite decades of speculation by investigators and amateur researchers. These mysterious documents represent physical evidence of human activity during the final phase of an impossible journey, artifacts that suggest planning, hope, or desperation that extended beyond simple survival. Their purpose died with whoever created them, leaving only questions about what 5 men might have experienced during months of drifting across the world's largest ocean. Maritime historians continue to debate whether Sarah Joe's crossing represents an anomaly or an example of ocean phenomena that occur more frequently than official records indicate. The Pacific holds stories of vessels found impossibly far from their origins, of debris that travels impossible distances, of currents that defy conventional understanding. But the gap between documented cases and classified military knowledge means that the full scope of such oceanic mysteries may never be publicly known. The memorial plaque at Hana Bay, where Sarah Joe began its final journey, serves a different purpose than its counterpart at Taongi Atoll. While the remote marker acknowledges mystery and loss, the Hawaiian memorial speaks to community and remembrance, to 5 lives that mattered beyond their mysterious fate. Local fishermen still pause there before heading out into waters that claimed their friends, reading names carved in bronze as a reminder that the ocean's beauty masks dangers that can transform routine expeditions into tragedies. Contemporary search and rescue operations in Hawaiian waters benefit from lessons learned during the hunt for Sarah Joe. But the fundamental challenge remains unchanged. When small vessels vanish into the Pacific's vastness, recovery becomes a race against time, weather, and the mathematical impossibility of searching infinite space with finite resources. Modern GPS tracking and satellite communication have reduced but not eliminated the possibility of vessels simply disappearing without explanation. The case officially remains open in Coast Guard files, though active investigation ceased decades ago. The families of 4 missing men occasionally receive calls from researchers or documentary producers seeking new angles on an old mystery, but these inquiries rarely produce new evidence or insights. The Pacific Ocean keeps its secrets with the patience of geological time, revealing just enough truth to maintain hope while concealing the details that would provide closure. Sarah Joe's hull, stripped of useful materials and gradually reclaimed by tropical decay, continues to weather on Sibilla Island, a monument to both human ambition and oceanic power. The boat that once carried 5 friends toward what they expected to be a day of fishing and camaraderie has become a symbol of the thin line between adventure and tragedy, between the familiar waters near home and the vast unknowns that lie beyond the horizon. The mystery endures because it encompasses questions larger than the fate of 5 individuals. How do ordinary people respond when faced with extraordinary survival challenges? What happens when civilian lives intersect with military secrecy? How does a society balance the need for truth against the requirements of national security? These questions remain as relevant today as they were in 1979, reminding us that even in an age of satellite surveillance and global communication, the ocean retains the power to swallow human lives without explanation, creating mysteries that persist long after the waves have erased all physical evidence of tragedy. The story of Sarah Joe stands as testament to both the ocean's terrible power and the enduring human need to understand what lies beyond the visible horizon, a need that persists even when the answers may be lost forever. In the silent depths of the Pacific, we're only scratching the surface. The next case is even stranger. Subscribe before it drops.